Okay, let's dive right in. We're tackling a shift in health today that's, well, it's both surprising and deeply concerning.
Hmm.
For years, colorectal cancer was often thought of as, a disease mainly hitting folks over 50, something maybe you put on your radar later in life.
Right, that was the standard thinking.
But that picture is changing fast and dramatically. It's really no longer just an old person's disease.
No, it's not. And it's become a leading cause of cancer death for younger adults, both men and women.
That really is the core of why this needs our full attention, isn't it?
Absolutely. The rise in rates among adults under 50, what we call early-onset colorectal cancer, it isn't some small blip. It's a major trend demanding answers.
And we've pulled together quite a stack of sources for this deep dive. We've looked at everything from cutting-edge university research, digging into potential biological
Like
triggers,
that at the cellular level.
to insights from doctors on the front lines actually seeing these patients, plus studies on screening effectiveness, how young people perceive the risk, the whole gamut.
Yeah, it's a complex picture. So our goal today is really to guide you through it. We'll unpack the scientific detective work trying to figure out why this is happening.
And highlight those absolutely critical warning signs that seem to be getting missed far too often.
Definitely. We'll also explore the discussion, the challenges around screening younger folks, and ultimately try to connect the dots on what this all means for you.
Okay, so let's lay out the problem first. Just how stark is this rise in younger adults? What are the numbers telling us?
The numbers are pretty striking, actually. If you go back, say, to the late 1990s, colorectal cancer was the fourth leading cause of cancer death for men and women under 50.
Fourth. Okay, so understandable, but maybe not top of mind for that age group.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to today. It's the number one cause of cancer death for men under 50.
Number one. Wow.
And the second leading cause for women in that same age group. That shift, from fourth to first and second in just a couple of decades. It's profound.
And we're specifically talking early onset, generally under 50. But didn't the source say almost half are even younger, like under 45?
That's right. Almost half are diagnosed younger than 45. So we're talking people in their 20s, 30s, early 40s.
We've unfortunately seen public figures affected, like Chadwick Boseman, Quentin Lee. It brings these stories forward, but the trend itself has been building for a while.
It really underscores that this isn't some rare anomaly anymore. It's becoming disturbingly common in an age group where historically it just wasn't.
So the massive question, why? Why is this happening? Researchers are digging deep, almost like detectives, right?
Yeah.
Especially with genomics.
Exactly, genomic detective work. They're looking for what they call genetic imprints. Think of it like forensic science, but for your DNA inside your cells.
Okay.
These imprints are like lasting marks, signatures left on our genetic code by different things we've been exposed to or processes our bodies have undergone.
And what kind of imprints are showing up in these younger patients? Anything specific?
Well, one really interesting finding is a strong link with a specific bacterial toxin. It's called colibactin.
Colibactin, okay.
Yeah, this toxin, produced by certain types of gut bacteria, seems to leave a very distinct genetic imprint right there on the genome of the colon cells.
So wait, it's not just having the bacteria, but something the bacteria makes that interacts with our body and leaves a literal mark on our DNA.
That's the idea. And the sort of strength and specificity of this genetic imprint suggests it could be a direct causal link in at least some of these cases. It's a really compelling piece pointing towards, environmental or maybe microbial triggers.
It's fascinating, and the sources mention this kind of fundamental work gets support from big players like Cancer Research UK, the NIH in the US.
Crucial funding.
But they also flagged potential budget cuts could slow things down and noted, standard disclosures about some researchers' financial ties, just for context.
Yeah, transparency is always key in research.
Yeah.
But okay, shifting gears a bit from the microbial world to something maybe more familiar, diet and lifestyle. This is another huge area of focus, but maybe with a new twist.
Right. We hear about diet and cancer constantly. But what's different here? Is there a specific mechanism they're looking at?
It seems so. Researchers from Ohio State, for instance, presented findings suggesting that young adults diagnosed with CRC are, biologically speaking, about 15 years older than their actual age.
15 years biologically older. That sounds significant. How does that connect back to diet?
Well, the proposed mechanism is that a typical Western diet, lots of prepackaged foods, refined grains, fried stuff, can really aggravate the gut bacteria.
Okay, stir things up, like you said.
Exactly. And that agitation triggers inflammation in the gut lining. That inflammation then seems to act like hitting the fast-forward button on cellular aging, specifically in the colon.
So it's like releasing the brake,
Yeah.
allowing things to grow that shouldn't.
That's a good way to put it. Releasing the brake, allowing tumors or precancerous cells to potentially grow faster because the normal aging controls are accelerated.
So it's not just the long-term wear and tear, but this accelerated aging driven by inflammation and gut bacteria interactions. That adds a real layer of urgency.
It really does. And adding to that, another study, this one from the Cleveland Clinic, used AI to analyze metabolite and microbiome data.
AI, okay. Metabolites, so the molecules our bodies make from food.
Exactly. And their AI analysis pointed specifically to these diet-derived molecules, the metabolites, as potentially the main drivers of risk in young-onset CRC.
More so than the bacteria themselves, maybe?
That was a key suggestion from their findings. They found higher levels of specific metabolites, ones related to arginine production and the urea cycle, in these young CRC patients.
And they linked those specific metabolites too.
Strongly linked them to long-term consumption patterns, particularly of red and processed meat.
Wow. That makes the general advice about red meat feel much more concrete, connecting it to these specific molecules identified by AI as risk drivers.
It does. And one kind of practical takeaway mentioned was that it might actually be simpler down the road to identify people at risk by tracking these metabolites in blood tests, since they reflect diet over time, than trying to sequence the incredibly complex DNA of everyone's gut bacteria.
Makes sense. And I gather this is actually changing conversations in the clinic.
It seems so. One doctor mentioned in the source material noted that because of findings like these, they now make it a point to discuss diet with all patients, framing it like, it's much simpler to change your diet than to fundamentally change your microbiome.
Reinforces that old saying, what's good for your heart is good for your colon.
Absolutely. It really brings that home.
But it's important too, right? While we're focusing on these new angles with diet and accelerated aging, the traditional risk factors haven't vanished. Family history, inflammatory bowel disease, they're still major players for some people.
Oh, absolutely critical to remember. They remain significant drivers. And that actually brings us nicely to the genetic piece. Even setting aside diet and environment for a moment, family history, and these sometimes previously unrecognized hereditary syndromes, they account for a really substantial chunk of young-onset cases.
How substantial are we talking?
Nearly half.
Nearly half of young onset cases have some hereditary link. That's huge.
It is. The breakdown is roughly about 15% carry mutations for known syndromes like Lynch syndrome or
Hey.
polyposis syndromes.
Okay, the ones we hear about.
Right. Another 5% or so have mutations in other relevant genes, things like BRCA or ATM, which we often link to breast cancer, but they increase CRC risk too.
Ah, interesting overlap.
And then there's another 15% who report a significant family history of CRC, but current testing doesn't pinpoint a specific known syndrome mutation. So the genetic component is definitely there for many.
Which means a lot of these younger patients, theoretically, already fall under guidelines that would recommend earlier screening, even before the general age was lowered.
That's correct, based on family history or known mutations.
Yeah.
But, even with genetics and these emerging diet links, there's this other massive hurdle we need to talk about, actually recognizing the warning signs when they do appear.
Yes. This feels like where things often fall apart, leading to delays.
It really does seem to be a critical point of failure. There was an important NCI study, National Cancer Institute, looking specifically at warning signs in young adults ages 18 to 49 using a big insurance claims database.
Okay, what did they find? What should people be watching for?
They pinpointed 4 key symptoms that tended to show up somewhere between 3 months and 2 years before the actual diagnosis.
3 months to 2 years before. Okay, crucial window. What are the 4?
Okay. Abdominal pain, rectal bleeding, persistent diarrhea, and iron deficiency anemia.
And having these signs really bumped up the risk.
Dramatically. Just having one of those symptoms nearly doubled the likelihood of an early onset CRC diagnosis compared to someone without them.
Doubled with just one. Wow.
And if someone had 3 or more of those signs, their likelihood was associated with being 6 times higher.
6 times. That is a massive red flag.
Huge. And here's something really important the source highlighted. These specific signs were actually more strongly associated with CRC in the younger group, the 18 to 49-year-olds, compared to slightly older adults, like 50 to 64.
So the message really has to be, don't ignore these symptoms in a younger person. They might be even more significant signals in this age group than we previously thought.
Precisely. But the reality, according to the sources, is that they are being dismissed all too often. and this leads to significant delays in diagnosis.
How long are we talking?
The median delay was nearly 10 months from when symptoms started to diagnosis if someone had just one sign.
10 months.
Even with something as seemingly obvious as rectal bleeding, the median delay was still 7 months. And even if someone had 3 or more of those warning signs, the median delay was still almost 5 months.
That's terrifying. Months of delay, even with multiple red flags. Why? Is it patients downplaying it, doctors missing it, or both?
It seems to be a combination, really driven by perception. Both clinicians and patients often chalk these symptoms up to less serious things in younger people.
Like what? What are the common assumptions?
Oh, it's just IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or it's stress, I ate something bad, hemorrhoids for the bleeding. People just aren't thinking colon cancer in a 25 or 35-year-old. The perception is still stuck on it being an older person's disease.
So the call to action here is vital. Patients need to speak up if symptoms persist, and doctors need to be much quicker to investigate these 4 red flags in younger adults.
Absolutely. Prompt evaluation is critical for catching these cancers earlier, when treatment is much more likely to be successful.
Okay, so given these rising rates in younger people, the screening guidelines have changed, haven't they?
Yes, that's right. Back in 2018, responding directly to this trend, the American Cancer Society lowered the recommended age for average-risk individuals to start screening from 50 down to 45.
That seems like a logical step, given the data. But I remember the sources bringing up some nuances. Is the evidence for screening effectiveness in that specific 45 to 49 group as rock solid as for, say, 50 plus?
That's where some debate and questions come in. While the guideline changed based on modeling the trends, some analyses point out there's less direct empirical evidence showing screening works just as well, specifically in that 45 to 49 bracket.
So a lot of the benefit is extrapolated, assumed based on how well it works in older groups.
That's one perspective highlighted, yes. The benefits are often modeled or extrapolated from studies on older populations where, frankly, the disease is more common and we have more long-term data. Some older trials, like the Nadium trial, didn't show a clear mortality benefit specifically for younger folks within the broader age ranges studied.
Though maybe those studies weren't really designed to detect that specific difference.
Exactly. They might not have been powered sufficiently to isolate the effect just in the 45 to 49 group. It's definitely complex.
And screening itself isn't risk-free, right? There are potential harms and costs to consider.
Correct. Colonoscopy, which is the most common screening test in the U.S., does carry small risks, things like perforation or bleeding. The risk is slightly lower in younger adults, maybe 6 per 10,000 procedures, versus 7 to 10 per 10,000 for those over 50.
Still, it's not zero. And lowering the starting age means more procedures overall.
Significantly more over your lifetime. Modeling suggests something like 5,600 lifetime colonoscopies per 1,000 people screened starting at 45, compared to about 4,100 if you start at 50.
And more procedures mean more cost, too.
Yes, cost is part of the equation, even if guidelines don't always put it front and center. One illustrative calculation showed a slightly higher cost per death-averted screening, from 45 versus 50, maybe $2.0 million versus $1.8 million. So there's definitely an ongoing discussion about balancing the benefits, harms, and resources for this younger age group.
And here's a key question. Even with the recommendation lowered to 45, are people in that age group actually getting screened? What's the uptake like?
Yeah, that's a major issue. Uptake is, unfortunately, very low. Based on 2021 data, less than 20% of 45 to 49-year-olds were actually up to date with screening.
Less than 1 in 5. That's really low.
It is. And there were disparities, too. Rates were lower for the uninsured, those with less education. Interestingly, rates were similar between black and white individuals in that data, but lower for Asian individuals compared to white individuals. But the main story is just low uptake across the board for that 45-49 group.
Okay, so we've got this worrying rise, complex potential causes being investigated, symptoms often missed leading to delays, a guideline change facing some debate, and crucially, very low uptake anyway. It feels like a really multifaceted challenge. Where do we go from here? What's on the horizon?
Well, one promising direction is this idea of precision cancer screening.
Precision screening, meaning more personalized.
Exactly. Moving beyond just age and maybe family history to tailoring screening recommendations, when to start, how often, maybe even what type of screening based on an individual's unique combination of risk factors.
So using genetics, lifestyle, environment, maybe those metabolites we talked about earlier.
Precisely, trying to build a more complete risk profile. Risk calculation models that combine multiple factors are showing they can be more accurate at identifying who's truly at higher risk than just using age and family history alone. This could help us target screening efforts much more effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. Target the resources where they're needed most, but implementing that must be tough.
Oh, there are significant challenges. We need better ways to identify people at higher risk beyond those with known genetic syndromes or super strong family histories. We need the resources like enough colonoscopy capacity, if that's the tool. And critically, we need effective ways to communicate this more complex, personalized risk information to people so they understand it and can act on it.
And stepping back even further, how do young people themselves even think about this? Is bowel cancer even on their radar?
That's where some interesting qualitative research comes in. One study looked at teenagers' perceptions, and overwhelmingly, they saw bowel cancer as a disease of late middle age, 40s, 50s, older.
Not something relevant to them now.
Exactly. They tended to think it happens later due to the natural process of aging cells, as they put it.
Which probably means they push off thinking about prevention.
It seems so. That perception can lead them to postpone thinking about preventative behaviors. They also seem to struggle a bit understanding how certain lifestyle factors, like physical activity, actually connect to bowel cancer risk. It was maybe easier for them to grasp how something you eat could cause harm directly.
And maybe the disease just doesn't have that high public profile compared to others.
That seemed to be a factor too. They might underestimate their own potential risk, partly because it's just not talked about as much, especially for younger people.
So awareness efforts really need a shift in strategy. Make it feel more relevant, more tangible.
Yes, exactly. Interventions need to make that future risk feel more real, more immediate somehow. They need to clearly explain the serious consequences, but also, crucially, articulate the mechanisms, the why and how preventative actions like diet and exercise actually work to reduce risk. Understanding that link seems key for motivating younger people.
Okay, so let's try and bring all these threads together. We've talked about the alarming rise, the detective work into causes, bacteria, diet, genes, the huge problem of missed symptoms, the screening debates and low uptake, the potential for precision screening, and this perception gap among young people. What are the main takeaways for you listening right now? What does this all boil down to practically?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that this is clearly a complex issue. There isn't one single cause. Researchers are actively investigating multiple interacting factors, potential environmental triggers like that colibactin toxin leaving genetic marks, diet potentially speeding up cell aging in the colon, alongside known and maybe still unknown genetic factors.
And secondly, those symptoms in young adults, abdominal pain, rectal bleeding, diarrhea, iron deficiency anemia, they are absolutely critical warning signs. They're being missed too often, leading to dangerous delays.
Definitely. And third, while screening guidelines have adapted by lowering the age for average risk to 45, there's ongoing discussion about the specific evidence for that age group, and perhaps more importantly, very few people in that group are actually getting screened yet. The future likely involves getting smarter about identifying individual risks.
So practically speaking, for you listening, pay attention to your body. That seems paramount.
Absolutely. Don't dismiss persistent symptoms, especially those 4 red flags we mentioned. Talk to your doctor. Be your own advocate if you have concerns or known risk factors like family history. Don't let things get brushed off easily.
And lifestyle matters. That came through loud and clear.
It really did. The research strongly highlights diet, particularly limiting red and processed meat and physical activity, as significant modifiable factors. These are things largely within your control that seem clearly linked to this risk.
This deep dive really paints a picture of a worrying trend, but also intense scientific effort to understand it and fight back.
It shows just how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Our environment, our food, the bacteria living in us, our genes, and crucially, our own awareness and perception of risk.
So maybe a final thought to leave people with. Given this emerging understanding that things like diet and environment might be leaving these molecular imprints really early in life, maybe decades before a diagnosis, it really raises a provocative question, doesn't it? Are the seeds of these young onset cancers potentially being sown much, much earlier than we ever thought? Maybe even in childhood or adolescence? And if that's the case, how early do we truly need to start thinking about prevention, about awareness, and perhaps even about personalized monitoring if we want to bend this very concerning curve?